Chapter 13. The Current of Tears. The raft was shrinking. It was a subtraction sum written in ice. Every time the black dorsal fins cut the water, creating a bow wave that washed over the surface, the edges of Silas's sanctuary melted away. The slush was washing into the sea. The solid core was cracking. Silas stood in the centre, feet wide apart, knees bent. He held the bone harpoon with both hands, the iron tip pointed at the water. He was spinning. The current had caught the raft. They were spinning slowly, clockwise, as drifting north at a terrifying speed. The steam of the cradle, his only hope, was receding into the mist. "Steady," he signalled to Barnaby. The dog was pressed flat against the ice. Claws dug in, whining a high-pitched note of terror. Barnaby smelled the orcas. It was a smell of old blood and deep, pressurized musk. Swish. 3 fins appeared in formation. They weren't attacking. They were swimming parallel to the raft, matching its speed. They were observing. Silas looked at the lead orca. It rolled slightly onto its side. An eye appeared above the waterline. It wasn't the dead, black eye of a shark. It was an eye with a soul. A dark, intelligent, malicious soul. It looked at Silas not as food, but as a physics problem to be solved. How do we get the meat off the plate? The orca submerged. "Hold on," Silas screamed silently. He knew what was coming. The 3 whales turned. They swam away about 50 yards. Then they turned back. They charged. They didn't hit the ice. They dove just before impact, their massive tails driving down. Roar. The displacement created a wave. A 3-foot wall of freezing water surged over the edge of the raft. It hit Silas and Barnaby. The force was immense. It wasn't just water. It was liquid concrete. Silas was knocked off his feet. He slid across the slick surface. He clawed at the slush. He felt the edge of the raft under his chest. His head hung over the abyss. Below him, the water boiled, jaws opened. The lead orca was waiting right there, vertical in the water, mouth agape, expecting the seal or boy to slide right in. Silas looked into the pink gullet. He saw the rows of conical teeth. He didn't panic. He didn't scramble back. He thrust. Thwack! He drove the ancient meteoric iron tip of the harpoon straight down into the orca's sensitive snout. The whale thrashed. It hadn't expected the seal to bite back. It slammed its jaws shut, missing Silas's nose by an inch, and dove. The wave receded. Silas scrambled back to the centre of the raft, coughing up salt water. He dragged Barnaby with him. The dog was wet, shivering violently. "They are testing us," Silas thought. That was just the first wave. He looked around. The raft had lost another 2 feet of diameter. It was barely 6 feet wide now. And the current was getting faster. They had entered the throat. The sailors called it the Current of Tears. It was a violent strip of water where the Atlantic met the Arctic outflow. It was a conveyor belt of death that dragged icebergs out to sea to melt. Silas looked at the shoreline. The cliffs of Greenland were a blurred grey line. He was losing. He looked at the harpoon. The tip was bent. He looked at the hatchet in his belt. He looked at the pack of supplies, the rum, the gold map, the hardtack. He had to make a choice. He couldn't fight the orcas forever. They would win. They had time. He didn't. He needed to leave the water. But there was nowhere to go. Unless... Silas scanned the horizon ahead. Drifting in the current, about 200 yards in front of them, was a shape. It wasn't a raft. It wasn't a ship. It was a burgee bit. A chunk of glacial ice about the size of a cottage. It rose 10 feet out of the water. It was high, too high for the waves to wash over, too thick for the orcas to break. But it was moving fast, and it was far away. Silas looked at his makeshift paddle, the harpoon. It was useless against this current. He looked at the orcas. They were regrouping for another wave. He had an idea, a crazy, suicidal idea. He waited. He watched the fins line up. "Come on," he whispered. "Do it again." The orcas charged. This time, Silas didn't brace himself in the centre. He ran to the back edge of the raft, the edge furthest from the whales. He grabbed Barnaby by the collar. The wave came, whoosh, as the water hit the raft, lifting it, tilting it forward. Silas didn't fight it, he rode it. He used the momentum of the wave to launch himself and the dog off the raft, not into the water, but toward a piece of debris floating nearby. It was a long, flat plank, a piece of the Archangel's decking that had drifted with them. Thud, they landed on the plank. It submerged under their weight, soaking them to the waist, then bobbed back up. It was unstable. It was tiny. But the push from the wave gave them speed. They shot forward, surfing the wake of the orca's attack. The whales were confused. They were looking for the boy in the water near the raft. By the time they realized the prey had moved, Silas was 20 yards away, paddling frantically with the harpoon. "Paddle!" he screamed at the universe. He drove the plank toward the Bergy bit, the iceberg cottage. The current swirled, the plank spun, the iceberg was looming large. It was a wall of blue, sheer and slippery. But there was a ledge, a small shelf near the waterline. They were going to crash. "Jump," Silas signaled. He grabbed the pack. He grabbed the dog. The plank slammed into the iceberg. Crack! Silas threw himself onto the ledge. He scrambled, his boots slipping on the glass-smooth surface. He dug the hatchet into the ice. Chunk. He pulled. He hauled himself up. He reached back and grabbed Barnaby's scruff just as the dog began to slide back into the water. He heaved. They tumbled onto the ledge. Safe. Silas looked down. The plank was gone, splintered. The orcas were circling the spot where the plank had been. They breached, looking up at the iceberg. The lead whale blew a spout of mist, a sound of frustration. They couldn't reach him here. The ledge was 5 feet up. Silas collapsed against the wall of the iceberg. He laughed, a dry, silent, hacking laugh. He had outsmarted the engineers, but the laughter died in his throat. He looked around. He was on an iceberg, a solid, safe island. But this island was drifting. It was caught in the current of tears. He looked at the compass. North-northeast. They were heading out into the open Atlantic, away from land, away from the cradle. The iceberg wasn't a fortress. It was a prison ship. And the warden was the ocean itself. Silas sat up. He shivered. The wet clothes were beginning to freeze stiff. He needed to get warm, but there was nothing to burn here. No wood, no fat, only ice. He looked at the pack, the rum. He pulled out a bottle. He uncorked it. He took a drink. The alcohol burned his throat like lava. It hit his empty stomach and exploded. For a moment, the illusion of warmth spread through his chest. He handed the bottle to the air. "To Thorn," he toasted silently. "May you rot in the belly." He huddled with Barnaby. The iceberg drifted. The sky began to darken. Night was coming, and with the night came the fog. It wasn't normal fog. It was sea smoke, frost smoke. It swallowed the world. It erased the stars. Silas couldn't see the water anymore. He couldn't see the orcas. He could only hear. And what he heard made no sense. Crash. Caw. Birds? Birds didn't fly this far out at night. And the crash of the waves, it sounded heavy, like surf hitting a cliff. Silas stood up. He squinted into the fog. The iceberg was rotating. Suddenly a shape loomed out of the mist. Dark, jagged, immense. It wasn't land. It was an island. But not of rock. It was an island of icebergs. A berg field. Hundreds of them, grounded together, fused by the pack ice, creating a massive artificial continent floating in the middle of the current. And stuck in the middle of this frozen graveyard was a ship, not a wreck. A ship with masts standing, a ship with sails furled, a ship with a light in the window. Silas rubbed his eyes. Was it the rum? Was it the hypothermia? A ghost ship? The iceberg drifted closer. It was going to collide with the edge of the berg field. Silas braced himself. Boom! The impact threw Silas to the ground. But he didn't care. He had a bridge. He could cross from his drifting prison to the stationary ice field. He could reach the ship. He looked at the light. A yellow, steady beacon in the grey hell. Was it salvation? Or was it another archangel? Another tomb full of mummies? One way to find out, Silas thought. He stood up. He stepped onto the new ice. The berg field was a landscape born of violence. It was formed when massive tabular icebergs collided and fused together under the crushing pressure of the pack ice. The result was a chaotic terrain of jagged peaks, deep crevasses and flat plateaus, all drifting together as a single island. Silas moved cautiously. The ice here was old, blue and hard as diamond. The fog, the sea smoke, swirled around him, thick and heavy. It muffled sound, turning Barnaby's bark into a dull thud and the crash of the distant waves into a soft whisper. Silas kept his eyes on the yellow light. It was the only constant in a shifting world. As he got closer, the shape of the ship resolved itself. It wasn't a whaler. It was sleek, with a naval profile. Black hull, painted with a white stripe. The masts were raked back slightly. A British naval explorer. Silas had seen prints of them in the orphanage library. Ships sent by the Admiralty to find the Northwest Passage. Ships that sailed into the white and never returned. This one sat in a cradle of ice, listing slightly to port. The ice had grown up around her hull, embracing her, holding her upright. She looked peaceful, undamaged. Silas reached the side of the hull. The wood was coated in a layer of frost so thick it looked like sugar. There was no ladder, but the chains of the mainmast shrouds were encased in ice, forming a rough staircase. "Stay," Silas signalled to Barnaby. The dog whined, pacing on the snow. He didn't like this place. It smelled too clean, too sterile. Silas began to climb. Crunch, clink. He pulled himself up. Hand over hand, the captain's coat weighed him down, but the fear of the open ocean pushed him upward. He vaulted over the rail and landed on the deck. Whoomp! The deck was buried under 2 feet of pristine, white snow, smooth, unbroken. There were no footprints. Silas frowned. If there were no footprints, who lit the lamp? He scanned the deck. The ship's wheel was a mound of white. The cannons were ice sculptures. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Silas drew his hatchet. He walked toward the stern, wading through the drifts. The light was coming from the skylight of the captain's cabin. He reached the skylight. It was covered in rime, but a small circle had been melted in the centre by the heat from below. Silas wiped the glass with his sleeve. He peered down. Ting, ting, ting-a-ling. The sound filtered up through the glass. Inside the cabin, it was warm. A stove was glowing cherry red. And sitting at a large mahogany table was a man. He was old. His hair was long and white, cascading down his shoulders like a snowy mane. He wore a formal naval uniform, tattered but brushed clean, with gold epaulettes that glinted in the lamplight. He wasn't moving. His hands were folded on the table. In front of him, a mechanical music box turned slowly, and surrounding him were clocks, dozens of them, carriage clocks, ship's chronometers, pocket watches. They covered every inch of the table, the shelves, even the floor. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The cabin was a cathedral of time. Silas pulled back. A survivor? A madman? He walked to the companionway door. It wasn't locked. The handle turned stiffly. Creak! Warm air rushed out, smelling of beeswax and tea. Silas stepped inside. He stomped the snow off his boots. The old man didn't turn around. He didn't jump. He simply reached out a skeletal hand and wound the music box. Crank, crank. "You're late," the man said. His voice was dry, dusty, like parchment paper crumpling. It was an English accent, refined and aristocratic. Silas stood in the doorway, hatchet in hand. He tapped the doorframe with the handle. Knock, knock. The man finally turned. His face was a map of wrinkles, pale as parchment. But his eyes were covered by dark leather goggles with narrow slits cut into them. Snow goggles. "I said you're late, Lieutenant," the man repeated. "The tea has gone cold." He peered at Silas through the slits. He tilted his head. "You're small for a lieutenant. And you're wearing American wool?" The man stood up. He was tall, gaunt. He leaned on a cane made of whalebone. "Who are you?" the man demanded. "A phantom? Or a thief?" Silas lowered the hatchet. He pointed to his mouth, then shook his head. The man stepped closer. He sniffed the air. Salt, blood, rum, and he sniffed again. "Dog!" Barnaby barked from the ice below. The man's face softened. A look of profound, heartbreaking wonder crossed his features. "A dog," he whispered. "A living dog." He sank back into his chair, as if the realization was too heavy to bear. "Then I am not dead," he murmured. "Or perhaps hell has dogs too." He looked at Silas. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit," the man commanded, his voice regaining a shred of authority. "If you are real, you will drink tea. If you're a ghost, you will listen." Silas hesitated. He looked at the stove. He looked at the chronometers ticking in unison. He was tired. So tired. He walked to the chair. He sat down. The man poured a cup of dark liquid from a silver pot. It wasn't tea. It was hot water with a hint of spruce needles. "I am Commodore Franklin," the man said. "Of Her Majesty's ship, the Erebus." Silas froze. The Erebus, the most famous lost ship in history, vanished 5 years ago. "And you, my silent friend," Franklin whispered, leaning forward, the goggles reflecting the lamplight like black mirrors. "You have just boarded the ship that sails nowhere. Bong, ting, dong." The sound was deafening. Silas looked at the clocks. They didn't show the time. They all showed the same date, May 1845, the day the ship died. Silas realized then he hadn't found salvation. He had found a tomb where time had stopped, but it was a warm tomb. Silas took the cup. He drank. Outside, the ice field drifted north, carrying the boy, the dog, and the mad Commodore into the eternal night. Chapter 14, The Clockmaker of the Arctic. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was a heartbeat. Not of a living thing, but of a machine. It filled the cabin, layering over itself in a chaotic, hypnotic rhythm. Some clocks beat fast, like the pulse of a hummingbird. Others swung slow and heavy, like the stride of a giant. Silas sat in the velvet armchair. He held the porcelain cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into his frozen palms. The steam rising from the spruce tea smelled of pine forests, a scent he hadn't smelled since he was 5 years old. Across the table, the old man, Commodore Franklin, was working. He had removed his heavy snow goggles, revealing eyes that were clouded white with cataracts. He was blind, yet his hands moved with the precision of a surgeon. He was disassembling a pocket watch. "You're wondering," Franklin said, his voice barely rising above the ticking, "why a blind man needs so many clocks." Silas didn't answer. He took a sip of the tea. It was bitter, astringent, but it cut through the layer of grease coating his throat. "Time," Franklin continued, picking up a tiny cog with tweezers. is different here. In London, time is a straight line. You are born, you serve the Queen, you die, but in the ice, time is a circle. The sun circles the horizon without setting. The ice drift circles the pole. And the men... He paused. He tilted his head, listening to the main chronometer on the wall. The men circle their own madness. Franklin placed the cog into the watch mechanism. It clicked perfectly into place. I keep the clocks, he whispered, to remind the world that we still exist. As long as one gear turns, the Erebus is not lost. She is merely waiting. Barnaby was lying by the stove, twitching in his sleep. The heat was making the dog dream. Franklin reached out a hand. Without looking, he found the exact spot where Barnaby's head lay. He stroked the fur. "We ate the dogs first," Franklin said casually. "In the second winter. It was necessary. The tins were poisoned. You see, lead. It drove the men mad before it killed them." Silas stiffened. He looked at the Commodore. Was this man a cannibal too, like Stubb? But Franklin's touch on the dog was gentle. "I did not eat," Franklin said. "I am the captain. A captain does not eat his crew. That is why I am here. And they..." He gestured vaguely toward the bow of the ship. "They're outside." Silas looked at the door leading to the main deck. He remembered the untouched snow. The silence. "Where?" Silas tapped on the table. Franklin smiled. A sad, broken smile. "Under the ice, Lieutenant. They are part of the architecture now." Silas set the cup down. Clink. The sound was sharp. Stum. Franklin's head snapped up. "You are not a lieutenant," the Commodore said sharply. "A lieutenant drinks with his pinky out. You clutch the cup like a drowning man clutches a spar." He leaned forward, his blind eyes searching. "And you have not spoken a word, not a 'thank you, sir,' not a 'God save the Queen.' You're silent." Franklin stood up. He grabbed his cane. "Stand up," he commanded. Silas stood up. He felt the weight of the hatchet in his belt. Franklin walked around the table. He stopped in front of Silas. He reached out a hand. "May I?" he asked. Silas hesitated, then nodded. He realized the man couldn't see the nod. He took Franklin's hand and placed it on his own shoulder. Franklin's fingers traced the fabric of the coat. "American wool," Franklin muttered. "Rough weave, whaler's quality." His hand moved up to the collar. Seal fur, badly stitched. He touched Silas's face. His fingers were cold, dry like paper. He traced the jawline, the nose, the scar on the cheek. "A boy," Franklin whispered. "A child." His hand moved to Silas's mouth. He felt the tension in the jaw. The way Silas's lips were pressed together in a permanent seal. "Ah," Franklin breathed. "I see. You've seen the devil, haven't you, son? And he stole your tongue." Silas pulled back. The touch was too intimate, too perceiving. Franklin lowered his hand. He looked incredibly old in the lamplight. "It is a good survival trait," Franklin said, turning back to his clocks. "The ice hates noise. It hunts noise. That is why the Erebus survives. We are quiet. We let the clocks do the talking." He walked over to a large map pinned to the wall. It was covered in circles and lines drawn in charcoal. "Come here, boy. Since you're not a ghost, you must be a traveller. And travellers need to know where they're going." Silas walked to the map. It was a chart of the Arctic Ocean, but it was wrong. The coastlines were distorted. "You think we're drifting north," Franklin said, tracing a line with his cane. "That is what the compass says. But the compass lies here. The magnetic pole is a trickster." He tapped a spot on the map. A large swirl drawn in the middle of the white void. "This is us. The Berg Field. We are caught in the maw. The great eddy." He looked at Silas. "We are not drifting to the ocean. We are drifting to the grind." As if on cue, the ship shuddered. The clocks on the wall rattled. The tea in the cup rippled. "The grind," Franklin repeated. "Where the ice floes meet the land-fast ice, it is a millstone. It crushes everything. He pointed to the chronometers. I have calculated the drift speed, based on the vibrations, based on the stars. He pointed to a specific clock. It was counting down. 4 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. 4 hours, Franklin said, his voice grim. The grinders pinned us against the land-fast ice. We have a bridge. Lieutenant, a temporary bridge of rubble. But in 4 hours, the pressure will peak and crush this ship into splinters. Silas looked at the map. He looked at the countdown. 4 hours. He looked at Barnaby. The dog was awake now, sensing the tension. Silas tapped the map. He pointed to the west, to the coastline. Franklin shook his head. Impossible. The ice between here and the coast is the shatter, unwalkable, unstable. Silas tapped again. He pulled out the map he'd stolen from Thorne, the geological map. He slammed it onto the table. Franklin frowned. He ran his fingers over the paper. He felt the texture. Russian, he murmured. I felt this paper once, on a diplomat in St. Petersburg. He traced the lines with his fingertips. He felt the indentation of the drawing of the whale's mouth. Cave. A warm cave, Franklin whispered. A geothermal sanctuary. He laughed, a bitter, dry sound. We looked for it, Crozier and I. We looked for the tropical valley of the legends. We found only death. He pushed the map back to Silas. It is a myth, boy. A story to make dying easier. Silas grabbed the old man's wrist. He forced Franklin's hand to touch the coat again. The dampness. The heat still lingering in the wool. I was there, Silas tried to say through touch. I walked through the warm tunnel. Franklin froze. He felt the damp heat. Steam? He whispered. You smell of sulphur. The realization hit the old Commodore like a physical blow. He staggered back, knocking over a stack of books. It exists, he gasped. The cradle exists. He looked around the cabin. At his clocks, at his prison. 5 years, he wept. We were 50 miles away. We starved 50 miles from salvation. He slumped into his chair. The energy drained out of him. Go, Franklin whispered. Take the dog. Go west. If you found the heat once, you might find it again before the grind catches you. Silas didn't move. He looked at the old man. Franklin was going to stay. He was going to sit here and wind his clocks until the ice crushed the ship into splinters. Silas looked at the pack. He had the harpoon. He had the hatchet. He couldn't save the Erebus. It was a tomb. But he looked at the map on the wall. Franklin had charted the shatter, the unstable ice. He knew the path through the danger even if he didn't believe in the destination. Silas tapped the table. He grabbed Franklin's cane. He tried to pull the man up. No, Franklin snapped, pulling away. I am the captain. I go down with the ship. It is the rule. Silas grabbed the cane again. He yanked it hard. He pointed to Barnaby. Then he pointed to the door. He mimed walking. He picked up the music box. He shoved it into Franklin's hands. Take your time with you, he signalled. But move. Franklin stared at the music box. It was playing Greensleeves. Why? Franklin asked. Why save a ghost? Silas looked at the old man. He remembered the orphanage. He remembered being left behind. He took the slate from the table, a chalk slate used for calculations. He wrote one word, alone. Then he crossed it out. Franklin touched the slate. He traced the letters. A tear leaked from his blind eye, cutting a clean track through the dust on his cheek. Very well, Franklin whispered, but we will need more than a cane. He stood up. He walked to a locker in the corner. He pulled out a device. It was strange. A brass frame with intricate gears and a heavy spring. A chronometer detonator, Franklin said. I built it to blow the ice. It never worked. The powder was wet. He handed it to Silas. But the mechanism is sound. If you have dry powder, this can turn a minute into an explosion. Silas thought of the rum, He thought of the sulphur in the tunnel. He took the device. "And this," Franklin said. He pulled a heavy, fur-lined sledging coat from the locker. He put it on over his uniform. He looked like a polar bear in gold braid. "Lead the way, Lieutenant," Franklin said. "Let us race the grind." Tick-tock. They left the cabin. They stepped out onto the deck of the ghost ship. The fog had lifted slightly, and in the distance, to the north, came a sound that shook the world. Grrr rumble. The grind had begun. The ice field was colliding with the land-fast ice. The edge of the world was crumbling, and it was coming for them. Silas, Barnaby, and the blind Commodore climbed down the side of the Erebus. They hit the ice running. The journey out of the berg field was a dance of trust. To the naked eye, the landscape was a chaos of white. Snowdrifts hid crevasses deep enough to swallow a cathedral. Pinnacles of ice rose like jagged teeth, blocking the horizon. Silas held the sleeve of Franklin's heavy sledging coat, guiding the blind man around large obstacles. But it was Franklin who led the way. The old Commodore moved with a strange, jerky grace. He didn't just walk. He swept his whalebone cane in front of him in wide arcs, striking the ice, then pausing to listen to the reverberation. Tap. Listen. Step. Soft snow to the left, Franklin muttered, his head cocked to the side like a bird. "Do not step there, Lieutenant. It is a bridge over nothing." Silas pulled Barnaby to the right. He looked at the soft snow. It looked exactly like the solid path. He tossed a chunk of ice onto it. Whomp! Silence. The snow crust collapsed, revealing a blue-black fissure that went down into the bowels of the iceberg. Silas swallowed hard. He looked at the blind man with new respect. Franklin didn't see the ice. He heard its density. "The shatter is singing today," Franklin whispered, tapping the ice again. Tension. The pressure wave from the grind travels faster through the solid ice than through the air. "Can you feel it?" Silas concentrated. Through the soles of Miller's boots, he felt it. A low, constant vibration. A buzzing. It was the shiver of a continent about to die. They moved deeper into the maze. The fog was thick, a freezing soup that coated their eyelashes in rime. "We need to go west," Silas thought, checking his internal compass. But Franklin turned north. Silas tugged on the coat. He grunted, pulling Franklin's arm toward the west. "No!" Franklin snapped, planting his feet. "Not that way. The echo is flat." "That means a wall, a dead end." He pointed his cane into the grey mist to the north. "That way, the wind smells of open water. There is a lead, a fracture." Silas hesitated. If they went north, they went toward the ocean, toward the drift. But the vibration under his feet was getting stronger. Rumble bump. A chunk of ice the size of a carriage fell from the nearby peak, shattering on the path behind them. They didn't have time to argue. Silas relented. He followed the blind man north. They navigated through a narrow canyon of ice. The walls towered 50 feet high, leaning in as if to crush them. Barnaby whimpered. The dog hated being enclosed. "Steady, animal," Franklin soothed, not breaking his stride. "Fear smells like ammonia. It confuses the senses." They emerged from the canyon and stopped. They had reached the edge of the berg field. In front of them was the seam. It was a nightmare of physics. The drifting berg field, where they stood, was colliding with the stationary pack ice the path to the shore. The collision wasn't a simple crash. It was a slow-motion grinding. Millions of tons of ice were being forced up into the air, creating a ridge of rubble ice that was constantly moving, churning and breaking. Blocks of ice as big as houses were being tossed around like dice. It looked like a giant white meat grinder. Crack, boom, grind. "The grind!" Franklin shouted over the noise. "We have to cross it before the pressure peaks." Silas looked at the churning chaos. It was suicide. There was no stable footing. The ground was moving up, down, and sideways, How? Silas signalled, grabbing Franklin's arm. Franklin pointed with his cane. Timing, Lieutenant. The pressure comes in waves, like the tide. Listen. Franklin closed his blind eyes. He raised a hand. Wait for the scream, then the silence. Silas listened. Crash! Grind! Screech! The ice screamed as a massive plate sheared off. Then, a momentary pause. The pressure released for a second before building again. Now! Franklin roared. He didn't wait for Silas. The old man launched himself onto the moving rubble. Silas grabbed Barnaby and jumped. They were running on an earthquake. Silas landed on a block of ice. It tilted. He jumped to the next one. It sank. Franklin was ahead, using his cane like a third leg, vaulting over gaps, moving with a desperate, instinctual agility. Left! Jump left! Franklin screamed. Silas jumped left. A second later, the spot where he had been standing was crushed by a towering slab of blue ice. Smash! They were halfway across. The noise was deafening. Ice shards flew through the air like shrapnel, cutting Silas's face. Barnaby slipped. The dog fell into a V-shaped gap between two grinding plates. Barnaby! Silas screamed silently. He lunged. He grabbed the dog's collar just as the plates began to close. He pulled. His boots slipped. The gap was closing. The jaws of the ice were shutting. Franklin turned back. He couldn't see, but he heard the struggle. The old man hooked the handle of his cane around Silas's belt. He hauled. With surprising strength, fueled by adrenaline, Franklin pulled the boy and the dog backward. Snap. The plates slammed shut, crushing the air out of the gap with a sound like a gunshot. Barnaby's tail missed amputation by an inch. They scrambled up the final slope of the ridge. They dove onto the flat, stationary ice of the pack. They rolled in the snow, gasping, coughing. Behind them, the grind continued its work, chewing up the edge of the berg field where they had stood seconds ago. They were safe. Silas lay on his back, staring up at the grey sky. His heart felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. Franklin sat up, adjusting his coat. He checked his pockets. He pulled out the chronometer detonator. It was intact. He pulled out the music box. It was dented, but still playing faintly. Ting. Ting. A near thing, Franklin wheezed. But punctual. Silas sat up. He looked at the old man. He reached out and shook Franklin's hand. A real, firm handshake. Franklin smiled. You are welcome, son. Silas stood up. He looked west. The fog was clearing on this side of the grind, and there, in the distance, rising from the jagged coastline, was the plume of steam, the cradle. But between them and the cradle stood a forest. Not a forest of trees, a forest of ice spires, sharp, vertical needles of ice, created by the steam vents melting the glacier from below, and moving among the spires were shadows. Silas squinted. The wolves? No, these were bigger, and they walked on two legs. Silas tapped Franklin's shoulder. He guided the blind man's hand to point west. What is it? Franklin asked. Do you see the heat? Silas tapped the hatchet handle. Danger. Franklin stiffened. The Watchers, he whispered. The Inuit legend spoke of them. The Toonbak's children. Silas checked the load on the musket bayonet. He checked the hatchet. They had crossed the ocean. They had crossed the grind. Now, they had to cross the territory of the unknown. Chapter 15. The Thermal Gate. The world turned from white to grey, and then to a bruised, misty green. They had entered the Needle Forest. It was a landscape born of a geological fever. The heat rising from the earth had melted the glacier from below, carving the ice into thousands of sharp, vertical spires. They rose 50 feet into the air, thin and fragile as glass, shrouded in a perpetual fog of steam. Silas walked in front, hacking at the dense mist with his hand. The air here was heavy, wet, and smelled of rotten eggs and boiled copper. It was hot. For the first time in weeks, Silas was sweating. Real, pouring sweat. He unbuttoned the captain's coat. Behind him, Commodore Franklin was breathing deeply, his blind face turned upward, drinking in the sulphur. Volcanic, Franklin rasped, tapping his cane on a patch of wet rock that protruded from the slush. "We are walking on the rim of a caldera, Lieutenant. The fire below is keeping the ice at bay." Barnaby panted heavily, his tongue lolling out. The heat was oppressive for the thick-coated dog. "Water," Silas thought. "We need fresh water." He saw a pool of meltwater gathered at the base of an ice spire. He knelt to drink. Franklin's cane cracked sharply across Silas's shoulder. "Don't!" the old man barked. "Look at the colour. Yellow, arsenic. You drink that, and you will die screaming." Silas pulled back. He looked at the water. It was oily, shimmering with lethal minerals. He looked at Franklin. The blind man had saved him again. They pushed deeper. The spires grew thicker. The shadows between them grew darker. And the feeling of being watched became a physical weight. Silas stopped. He gripped the hatchet. He scanned the mist. There, to his left, a shadow moved behind a pillar of ice. It was tall. Too tall to be a wolf. To his right, another one. They were being herded. "Commodore." Silas tapped the cane twice. "Danger." Franklin stopped. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked. "I hear them," Franklin whispered. Soft steps. Moccasins. Not boots. Fur on fur. He tightened his grip on the music box he still carried in his pocket. "The Toonback's children," Franklin murmured. "Or the Guardians." Suddenly, the mist ahead cleared. They had reached the end of the needle forest. And there, rising from the mist like the mouth of a giant beast, was the gate. It was a massive archway of black basalt rock, naturally formed but smoothed by centuries of wind and heat. It stood 100 feet high, contrasting violently with the white ice around it. Inside the archway, there was no ice, only darkness and warmth, a radiant, pulsating heat that rolled out in waves, and blocking the gate were the Watchers. 5 of them. They stood in a semicircle, blocking the path. They were human. But they looked like creatures forged from the landscape itself. They wore white furs, polar bear hides, but stripped of the hair in patches to reveal hardened leather armour underneath. Their faces were hidden behind masks made of whalebone, carved into terrifying, grimacing visages. They held weapons, not rifles, spears, harpoons, clubs made of walrus ivory. They stood absolutely still, silent sentinels of the cradle. Silas stepped back. He pushed Franklin behind him. Barnaby growled, a low, rumbling threat. One of the figures, the tallest one standing in the centre, stepped forward. The figure pointed a spear at Silas, not at his face, at his back, at the bone harpoon strapped to Silas's pack. The figure spoke. "Nagok. Tuluk." Franklin gasped. He grabbed Silas's shoulder. "I know that dialect," he whispered, turning his voice trembling. It's not possible. That is Old Inuktitut, the dialect of the spirits." "What did he say?" Silas tapped urgently on Franklin's hand. Franklin swallowed. "He said, 'Thief, return.'" Silas froze. The mummy, the kayak in the ice valley. He hadn't scavenged a weapon. He had robbed a grave, a royal grave. The bone harpoon wasn't just a tool, it was a holy relic, and Silas had brought it right back to its guardians. The leader of the Watchers raised his spear. The tip was meteoric iron, just like Silas's. The other 4 raised their weapons. They began to chant. Thump, thump, thump. They were closing in. Silas looked at the hatchet in his hand. It was useless against 5 armed warriors. He looked at the harpoon on his back. "Give it to them," Franklin hissed. "Give it back, boy, or they will flay us alive." Silas unslung the pack. He pulled the bone harpoon free. He held it out, handle first, an offering. The leader stopped. He tilted his bone mast head. He reached out a hand. The glove was made of white fur stained with red ochre. He grabbed the harpoon. He yanked it from Silas's grip. He inspected the tip, inspected the shaft. Then he looked at Silas. He didn't bow. He didn't step aside. He raised the harpoon and pointed the sharp end at Silas's throat. The offering was not enough. The crime had been committed. The penalty was blood. Silas backed up. He bumped into Franklin. They were trapped against an ice spire. The leader drew back his arm to thrust. Silas closed his eyes. So this is it. Not the cold, not the bear, but the past. "Wait," Franklin screamed. The old blind man stepped in front of Silas, spreading his arms wide. His gold epaulets flashed in the gloom. He shouted something. Not in English. He shouted in their tongue. "I glue, an Iraq, Erebus." The leader froze. The spear tip hovered inches from Franklin's chest. The watcher looked at the blind old man. He looked at the gold uniform. He lowered the spear slowly. He reached up and removed his bone mask. Silas stared. The face underneath was not what he expected. It was weathered, brown, and lined with age. But the eyes were blue, bright, piercing, unnatural blue. The eyes of a European mixed with the blood of the Inuit. The watcher looked at Franklin. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English. "Erebus," the watcher rasped. "Ghost ship." He looked at Silas. Then at Franklin. "You... alive?" Franklin nodded, tears streaming from his white eyes. "We are alive. We seek the warmth." The watcher looked at the harpoon in his hand. Then he looked at the gate behind him. He turned to his warriors. He made a signal. They lowered their weapons. The watcher turned back to Silas. A grim smile revealed teeth filed to points. "The warmth is not free," he said. "The cradle is full." He pointed to the darkness of the cave mouth. "You enter. You serve. Or you feed the dogs!" He threw the bone harpoon back to Silas. Silas caught it. He was confused. "Serve? Serve who?" Franklin asked. The watcher didn't answer. He just pointed into the dark tunnel. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of industry, the sound of a forge. Someone was building something inside the mountain. "Go," the watcher commanded. "Meet the king." Silas looked at the dark tunnel. The heat coming from it was inviting. But the sound was terrifying. The king? Thorne wanted to be a king, but there was already a king in the cradle. Silas adjusted his pack. He gripped the harpoon. He stepped past the watchers. He stepped into the gate. Boom. Darkness swallowed them. The only way out was through the fire. The ice has melted, but the dangers solidified. Silas and the Commodore have passed the gate, but they have traded the freedom of the freeze for the slavery of the heat. Who is the king of the cradle? What is being forged in the dark? And can a boy with a stolen voice survive in a kingdom of secrets? The sanctuary is a lie. The true horror begins underground. Silas has entered the belly of a new beast, and this one is awake. The finale is coming. Do not let the fire go out. Subscribe. The story continues.